Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a peculiar moment in history, a time so dark and strange it's almost like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. But trust me, it's real. Picture this, it's the year 536. The world, though centuries removed from the modern comforts we know, still thrives in ways that we can barely imagine. Now, imagine for a moment that everything around you begins to change. The air grows colder. The skies, once blue and clear, are now dimmed by a strange, heavy fog. You look up, and it feels like the sun itself is missing, like the day is stuck in a perpetual twilight. It's unsettling, isn't it? Kind of like someone's pulled a curtain across the sky and left you wondering if the world will ever feel right again. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, we're not talking about you today. We're going back in time to a moment when the entire world faced a terrifyingly unpredictable series of events. The year 536. Yes, a real year was one of the most difficult times in human history. If you were alive back then, you'd probably be asking yourself, what in the world is going on? Spoiler alert, no one really knew, not even the smartest people around. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fun to know how far we're traveling together tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year 536 was an unusual one, not only because of the eerie events, but also because, like so many of the world's biggest calamities, no one at the time knew quite what to make of it. If you think your day has been a little strange or unexpected, well, be thankful that you weren't living back then, when the whole world seemed to be turning upside down. Historians still argue about what happened exactly, but one thing is clear: that year marks the beginning of a global catastrophe, unlike anything people had experienced before. The sun gone, or at least hidden. The air thick, murky, and cold, as if the heavens themselves were weeping. What could have caused such a sudden and intense change? Was it divine punishment, a cosmic shift, or something far more scientific? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the very beginning, where things first began to go a little off. Imagine being there in 536. The world seems calm, even normal, but the first whispers of something unsettling are already starting to spread. You step outside, or perhaps you look out of a window. It's early in the year, and there's a chill in the air that shouldn't be there. Not quite the cold you'd expect during a typical winter, but a deep, unsettling coolness. It feels like something is wrong. The sun, once a steady and dependable presence, has slipped behind a veil of thick fog so thick that it almost feels like the world is held in some sort of twilight, an endless gray that makes even the brightest of days seem unnatural. You might be wondering, is this just a strange weather pattern, or is there something bigger going on? Well, there was something bigger going on, something far more significant than a passing storm. You're in the Byzantine Empire now, an empire that, despite its grandeur, is struggling to maintain control. The year 536 isn't just about a strange atmospheric event. It's the moment that sets in motion a series of environmental, social, and political shifts that would change the course of history. The people who lived through it, they were about to experience a kind of hardship that few others in history would ever understand. As strange as it may seem, historians believe that the empire was already on the brink of disaster before this eerie phenomenon began. The Byzantine Empire, once a beacon of power and wealth, had been ruled by Emperor Justinian, whose reign had seen both glory and significant setbacks. You might think of him as a ruler who had it all, except that things were already crumbling behind the scenes. political instability. Military pressure and social unrest had already been brewing like a storm in the distance. But now, a literal storm is brewing, and not just in the sky, in the air. The fog and strange atmospheric conditions that blanketed the world weren't just the result of one bad weather pattern. Historians believe that these phenomena were caused by a massive volcanic eruption. Somewhere in the world, an eruption so large it sent clouds of ash and debris high into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and altering the global climate. The precise location of this eruption remains unclear. Some suggest it was in Iceland, while others think it might have been in the Mediterranean. No matter the exact place, one thing is clear: it had catastrophic effects on the world's climate. Imagine the effect this would have on you. You step outside to go about your business, and instead of bright skies and warm sun, you're greeted by a dim, overcast sky that refuses to clear. Your crops start to wither. The air becomes colder, and soon enough your food stores are dwindling. This isn't just a bad summer. This is a shift that affects everything. From agriculture to health, from politics to war, the eruption's impact was everywhere. But it's not just the fog that's unsettling. It's what comes next, the way people begin to understand and react to the world around them. When the sun doesn't shine for an entire year, people can't help but assume the worst. There's a feeling that something divine is at work here, something that has caused the natural order to crumble. The Byzantine Empire, with its complex political structure, is forced to deal not only with the physical fallout of the eruption, but with the psychological toll it takes on its citizens. The fear of divine retribution is everywhere, with people flocking to the church for explanations. The clergy, perhaps sensing an opportunity, claim that this is a punishment from God, an omen of doom. Historians still argue about the role that religion played in this crisis. Some say that the religious fervor only deepened the sense of doom and paranoia, while others believe that the church became a source of solace in an uncertain time. Either way, the Byzantine people were facing an unprecedented crisis, one that not only challenged their physical survival, but their spiritual beliefs. The climate change had them questioning their very place in the world, something that happens when your natural environment seems to be betraying you. To make matters worse, the Byzantine Empire wasn't the only one suffering. From the farthest reaches of Europe to the steppes of Asia, the effects of the eruption were felt. In the east, Persia faced its own struggles as the cooling climate affected agriculture and the economy. In the west, the remnants of the Roman Empire, now divided into various Germanic kingdoms, struggled to maintain control in the face of famine and unrest. The year 536 might have started as an eerie event for one empire. But before long, it became clear that no one was exempt from its effects. Yet amidst all of this chaos, life continued. For the people of the time, there was no end of history to retreat to, only the slow, grinding reality of surviving each day. Imagine living through that kind of uncertainty. You don't know what's coming tomorrow, and all the usual signs of life, sunlight, good harvests, the steady pulse of political stability, are gone. You might begin to feel a bit adrift. But even so, the resilience of humans in the face of crisis is undeniable. People had to adapt, and they did. While the rich might have retreated to their palatial estates, the common folk were left to find solutions. Farming techniques adapted, though not always in the most scientifically efficient ways. People turned to more desperate means of survival. Some grew increasingly creative, or perhaps a little superstitious, as they tried to cope with the new normal. Historians debate whether the extreme weather was the sole factor behind the economic decline of the time. Perhaps it was also the increasing militarization of the world that led to a greater sense of scarcity, contributing to the collapse. The Byzantine Empire, already stretched thin from constant warfare with Persia, and other neighboring forces struggled to feed and supply its soldiers. It's possible that the combination of volcanic fallout and military strain was too much for the empire to handle. Even with all the turmoil, however, there's a certain fascination in understanding how people lived through this, how they managed to continue on despite the grim circumstances. The same can be said for the strange weather itself. In the present day, we might look at something like the eruption of a volcano and understand the science behind it. But back then, all they knew was that something had gone terribly wrong. And for those who lived through it, the year 536 became not just a year of suffering, but a turning point. The fear that came with it shaped the way entire generations thought about the world and their place in it. As the year progresses, something strange begins to happen, a phenomenon that would leave its mark on history. The cooling atmosphere doesn't just last for a week or a month. It drags on for over a year, plunging the world into a prolonged darkness. The days are shorter, the temperatures drop, and the sun's light is diminished to the point that the world is cast in an eerie twilight. The temperature dips so drastically that even in the summer months, it feels as though winter has arrived far too early. For those of us living in the present day, we might think of a few cold days and wonder if we should stay and drink something warm and enjoy the cozy shelter of our homes. But for the people of 536, this cold was not just a passing inconvenience. It was a slow-burn crisis that affected every aspect of life. Crops failed, animals starved, and the once predictable rhythms of life were completely upended. The year without summer, as it's sometimes called, isn't just some historical footnote. It's a profound event that changed the course of human history. Historians still argue about the specifics of what happened. Was the eruption truly the cause of the prolonged climate changes? Many scholars point to the eruption of a massive volcano, possibly in Iceland or the Mediterranean. This eruption, massive by any standard, released vast amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The ash cloud, so thick and so widespread, blocked out sunlight, cooling the Earth's surface for years. Some even say that this volcanic winter lasted much longer than initially expected, stretching into the early 540s. The impact on agriculture was immediate and devastating. Crops that had once thrived in the warmer temperatures were suddenly withering. Food shortages began to spread, and famine set in. As people saw their supplies of grain, vegetables, and livestock dwindle, they turned to whatever they could find to survive. For the wealthy, it might have meant drawing from their reserves, but for the common folk, it meant facing a stark reality. How do you survive when your food supply disappears and nothing is growing in the fields? The failures of agriculture were exacerbated by a drop in temperatures. In many regions, particularly in Europe and Asia, frost destroyed crops that were meant to last through the colder months. While many people would have simply blamed this on unfavorable weather, the truth is that this weather was not only unusual, it was apocalyptic. No one had experienced anything like it before, and there was no real understanding of how to counteract the consequences. You can imagine what it must have been like to witness this firsthand. The skies that were once clear and bright now remained overcast, the sun appearing only as a pale disk behind a thick veil of ash and smoke. People didn't just talk about the weather, they felt it in every part of their lives. The eerie glow in the sky and the chill that gripped the earth left them with a sense of helplessness. Survival became the #1 priority. Ancient records from the time speak of people abandoning farm cities, seeing their populations dwindle and death creeping in from every corner. The air, once filled with the scents of fresh bread and blooming flowers, now smelled faintly of ash and smoke. But it wasn't just the cold and the food shortages that were taking their toll. The lack of sunlight and the cool temperatures also led to a significant drop in food production, which then spiraled into famine. People couldn't grow enough to feed their families. Livestock didn't have enough forage to survive, and as a result, many animals perished as well. It wasn't uncommon for people to turn to anything they could get their hands on, whether it was whatever animals were left, or even wild plants. It's likely that the ancient inhabitants of the world saw starvation on a scale they had never encountered before. Many tried to survive by hunting, gathering, or scavenging what little food was available. But when there's nothing left, survival becomes an act of desperation. What's fascinating is the way people reacted to this. Ancient societies were not equipped with the technology and knowledge we have today to combat such a disaster. But they did have something else, a strong reliance on religion, ritual, and superstition. You could probably imagine that in such an uncertain and frightening time, the people sought answers from the divine. After all, what better explanation could there be for this mysterious, world-altering event than the wrath of a god or gods? The idea that the world was being punished, perhaps for some ancient sin, became a popular belief among the people. In fact, many turned to the church hoping for divine intervention, or at the very least, some kind of comforting word to explain what was happening. But for those who sought practical answers, there was little to be found. The cooling temperatures and widespread destruction made it nearly impossible to grow crops, and society was quickly descending into chaos. Imagine walking through a town where the markets are bare. The once thriving businesses are closing down, and the once vibrant streets are now silent. The usual signs of life, the bustling of traders, the laughter of children, playing outside, the sound of wagons rolling through town, are replaced by an oppressive stillness. It's like time itself has been frozen, leaving only confusion and fear in its wake. Even as the cold and darkness seem to stretch on endlessly, there are glimmers of hope. Some people, despite the overwhelming challenges, find ways to keep going. Ancient farming techniques, though rudimentary by today's standards, still provided some form of sustenance. People also started to adapt, trying to find food where they never had before. You might imagine someone out in the fields, gathering berries or hunting small animals, anything to keep their family fed. Despite the incredible hardship, there were always those willing to keep fighting, to keep struggling, in the hope that things would eventually get better. The eruption and the subsequent cold spell weren't just catastrophic events on a local scale. They were world-shattering events. They affected trade routes, disrupted the economy, and triggered a ripple effect that stretched across the globe. The Byzantines, who were already dealing with political instability and the pressure of ongoing wars, found themselves dealing with the fallout of this unprecedented disaster. Meanwhile, in the West, the remnants of the Roman Empire, divided among various Germanic tribes, were seeing the foundations of their civilization crumble. Historians still debate the exact cause of the 536 event. Was it one eruption or several? Was it the volcanic activity alone, or a combination of factors? Did it truly create a volcanic winter, or did it simply alter the global climate enough to push already fragile societies over the edge? No one is entirely sure. But what is certain is this: the world that people knew before 536 would never be the same again. The eruption was more than just a physical event. It marked the beginning of a new era. One where the climate could no longer be relied upon to be predictable, where food was no longer abundant, and where the rhythms of life were disrupted in ways people could never have imagined. As 536 unfolded, the world that had once seemed so stable and predictable began to unravel, and the people of the time had no idea just how much worse it would get. For over a year, the world was plunged into a state of almost unrelenting darkness. The sun, that ever-present source of warmth and light, had become little more than a distant memory. And as the months dragged on, that eerie twilight seemed to have no end in sight. People were no longer accustomed to the sun's warm embrace. They had to get used to living under a dim, cold sky that never fully brightened. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a world-altering event that felt like nature itself had turned against humanity. Imagine waking up each morning to an overcast sky, the kind that seems to stretch forever, with no hope of clearing. The cold air that fills your lungs doesn't just chill your body, it chills your spirit. You can't even remember the last time you felt a warm ray of sunlight on your face. Your crops have failed, and you know the chances of getting a good harvest this year are slim to none. You might have heard whispers of a volcanic eruption somewhere in the world, but who would have believed that something so far away could affect the entire planet? Historians still aren't completely certain about the cause of this prolonged cold snap, but one theory has emerged as the most plausible. A massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, sent ash and sulfur dioxide high into the atmosphere. The resulting volcanic winter, as it's now called, led to a significant cooling of the Earth's surface. This cooling, which lasted for more than a year, led to crop failures and famine on a scale that few could have predicted. The eruption itself would have been catastrophic for the surrounding area, but its global effects were even more devastating. The cloud of ash that blanketed the Earth blocked sunlight, lowering temperatures by as much as 1.5 degrees Celsius, about 7 degrees Fahrenheit on average. A change that might not sound like much to us, but which had a profound effect on agriculture and everyday life. But the effects weren't limited to agriculture. When the sun doesn't shine for a year, it doesn't just make farming difficult, it changes the entire fabric of society. It's almost as if time itself has slowed down. You'd wake up to the same gray sky with no sign of the sun, and every day seemed to blend into the next. People started to notice something strange. The seasons no longer followed the predictable patterns they once did. Where there should have been springtime blooms and summer warmth, there was only an unyielding coldness that refused to release its grip. The concept of time, once measured by the turning of the seasons, became more abstract, more disconnected from reality. As the crops failed, food became an increasingly precious commodity. Grain prices soared, and food shortages led to unrest and fear. People couldn't help but wonder if this was the end, if humanity had finally reached the breaking point. And it wasn't just the loss of food that created problems. The lack of sunlight also disrupted daily life in other ways. The days were shorter, and it seemed like there was no real sense of night or day anymore. What should have been a bright sunny afternoon felt like dusk. People couldn't even get a proper night's sleep. The constant, lingering gray light made everything feel off-kilter. But it wasn't just the uncertainty of the climate that plagued the people of 536. It was also the uncertainty of the world itself. In many ways, the darkened skies seemed to represent something deeper, a sense that the universe was somehow out of balance. And in an age where people often turn to religion for answers to the world's most troubling questions, it's no surprise that many began to see this global catastrophe as a sign of divine punishment. The skies had darkened, the crops had failed, and disease was spreading rapidly. What else could it mean but the anger of the gods? Historians still debate the extent to which religious beliefs influenced people's perceptions of the crisis. Many people at the time likely turned to their faith hoping that the divine would restore order. Some even believed that the darkness was a warning. Perhaps humanity had angered the gods in some way, and this was the price to be paid for those transgressions. The Church, of course, was quick to respond, offering guidance, prayers, and support. But despite their best efforts, there was little anyone could do to change the weather. There was no divine intervention that could make the sun reappear or the crops grow again. This period of darkness and cold was more than just a difficult year. It was a profound test of human resilience. It forced people to adapt in ways they hadn't before. Some of the more fortunate communities managed to adapt, relying on food storage or trade to see them through the worst of the crisis. Others weren't so lucky. Entire villages, starved and sick, were forced to abandon their homes in search of food. The famine and the dislocation were staggering, and many societies struggled to maintain their usual way of life. But while it seemed like everything was falling apart, people kept going. They had to. There was no other choice. People found new ways to gather food, to hunt, and to trade. Cities began to adapt by securing what supplies they could, often at the expense of neighboring regions. People grew more resourceful, trying to survive with what little they had left. It's fascinating to think that despite the environmental chaos and the darkness that enveloped the world, humanity didn't simply collapse. They adjusted, as they always do. But in the back of their minds, there was a constant fear. Would things ever return to normal? In many ways, this period of darkness represents a turning point not just for the people of 536, but for the entire world. It marked the beginning of a long and difficult period of recovery, but it also highlighted something about human nature. Despite the cold, despite the darkness, despite the disease and famine, humans managed to survive. They adapted, they fought, and they found ways to keep going, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Today, we look back at the year 536 with a mix of wonder and disbelief. We know the science behind the eruption, the volcanic winter, and its global impact. But in the moment, people couldn't have known what was causing the strange weather, let alone how long it would last. And for them, it wasn't just about the cold and the crops. It was about survival, faith, and the hope that one day the sun would return and life would return to normal. But for now, there was no sun, only the cold gray sky and the uncertain future that lay ahead. And yet through it all, life continued as it always does. The people of 536 held on to the hope that the darkness would eventually pass, even if they couldn't know when. They lived on, surviving in a world that had turned upside down, hoping that one day the world would warm again. Now let's take a moment to reflect on what was happening in the larger scope of things. What was going on across the world while people struggled through this strange, cold, and dim year of 536? It wasn't just the Byzantine Empire or Europe that were facing dire consequences from the global climate shift. The repercussions of the volcanic eruption that darkened the skies were widespread. The chaos wasn't confined to a single region. It stretched across continents and affected distant civilizations, each responding in its own unique way. In the Byzantine Empire, the impact was immediate and profound. The Byzantine Empire, under the rule of Emperor Justinian I, was already facing significant challenges. Justinian had ambitious plans, hoping to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. His campaigns against the Ostrogoths in Italy and the Vandals in North Africa were stretching the empire's resources thin. The military was fighting on multiple fronts, and the empire was already dealing with a strained economy. But when the volcanic winter struck, it only intensified the crises facing Justinian. Food shortages and crop failures across the empire led to inflation, with grain prices soaring to unprecedented heights. The people of the empire, already suffering under the weight of taxes and military burdens, found themselves facing even more hardship. The Byzantine economy was fragile, and these new pressures threatened to undo much of what Justinian had worked to build. Yet there was no quick solution. The crisis wasn't one that could be solved by a simple policy or a quick military victory. No matter how brilliant a leader Justinian was, he couldn't control the weather or undo the damage caused by the volcanic eruption. But it wasn't just the economy that was affected. The very fabric of Byzantine society was beginning to unravel. The failure of crops, the spread of disease, and the overall uncertainty created an atmosphere of fear and unrest. It wasn't long before the people began to lash out. Unrest erupted in Constantinople, where riots broke out in the city. The famous Nika riots of 532 were still fresh in people's memories. But now the riots weren't just fueled by political discontent. They were fueled by the fear that the empire could no longer sustain its population. The tension between the ruling elite and the lower classes grew stronger. And in the midst of this turmoil, Justinian had to deal with not only military threats from outside invaders, but with the social unrest bubbling up from within. The situation was not much better in the West. The remnants of the Roman Empire, which had fragmented into various barbarian kingdoms, were also feeling the effects of the global climate shift. Food scarcity, bad harvests, and failing crops were rampant across much of Western Europe. The once thriving cities were now plagued by famine and disease. The Germanic tribes that had carved up the Western Roman Empire were also struggling to survive their people, fighting for every morsel of food they could get their hands on. In many ways, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of the Germanic kingdoms were closely tied to these environmental pressures. In the north, the Viking tribes had not yet emerged as the seafaring warriors they would become, but they were still feeling the ripple effects of the volcanic winter. While we may associate the Vikings with later centuries, their ancestors, the Norsemen, were living through the same global climate disruptions that affected the rest of Europe. The cold climate, combined with crop failures and famine, would have influenced their way of life. Their ability to raid and conquer lands would later be a reaction to the harsh conditions they were living under. Though the Vikings are often remembered for their plundering, one must consider the possibility that their migration and raids were partially driven by the environmental crises of the time, an attempt to secure resources and find new lands for survival. While these disruptions were happening across Europe and Asia, the effects were similarly severe. In the Persian Empire, the ruling Sassanids found themselves battling both internal unrest and external threats from the Byzantine Empire. The cooling climate affected their agriculture and weakened their military efforts. The impact of the climate on the agricultural systems of Persia was as severe as it was in Europe, leading to famines that drained resources and morale. It is worth considering whether this environmental crisis led to shifts in the way these empires handled diplomacy and conflict. Were they more inclined to fight over dwindling resources? Or was the breakdown in agriculture more likely to unite people in the face of common hardship in the East? The Chinese Empire also experienced the consequences of a changing world, though they may not have felt the direct effects of the volcanic eruption. As immediately as the Western empires, the cascading environmental effects still influenced their agriculture and society. Just like in Europe, crops failed and food became scarce. The droughts and floods that affected the area were worsened by the global cooling, and the Chinese population found themselves facing a challenge that would set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Western Han Dynasty. The environment had become a weapon of nature, eroding the foundation of empires in its wake. While we can look back today and see the evidence of these global events, it's hard to fully comprehend what it must have been like to live through such an era. The people of 536 were unaware that the world they once knew would never be the same. Their day-to-day existence was shaped by forces beyond their control: the fog, the cold, the crop failures. It all came together in a way that left people uncertain of how to move forward. One thing is certain: the world of 536 was one where survival took precedence over everything else. Societies were forced to adapt quickly to an environment they didn't understand, and while some empires crumbled, others emerged stronger, having weathered the storm literally and figuratively. The human response to this crisis was remarkable, showing a deep sense of resilience. But the climate, as we now know, was only one part of the equation. The real test for these civilizations would be how they could manage both the natural disasters and the political, social, and economic challenges they faced. What's most remarkable is that despite the tremendous hardships, the people of 536, whether in the Byzantine Empire, Persia, China, or the Germanic tribes, kept pushing forward. Even though the year 536 might seem distant and far removed from our modern world, it offers an important lesson. The climate can shape the course of history in ways we may not fully appreciate until we are faced with its consequences. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine what it must have been like to live through a year when everything you knew was threatened by forces beyond your control. It's a sobering thought, but it's also a reminder of the resilience that lies at the core of human existence. While the Byzantine Empire, the various kingdoms of Europe, and the Persian Empire were all struggling with the devastating effects of the volcanic winter, there was a more insidious force silently creeping through the population. With the cold, the famine, and the unsettled atmosphere came another racist disease, the failure of crops. The mass movement of people and the pressure of living under constant fear and uncertainty provided a perfect breeding ground for illness. While many people were focusing on the food shortages, the strange sky, and the political unrest, a silent killer, was spreading its influence across the land. The bubonic plague, which would later become one of the most infamous pandemics in history, was making its first known appearance in the Byzantine Empire during this time. The plague, though it had been seen in other parts of the world in various forms, reached its most notorious point in the mid-6th century, coinciding almost exactly with the events of 536. The exact origins of the plague are still debated by scholars, but there's little doubt that it played a significant role in the shaping of history during this time. The disease spread rapidly through the empire, moving with the same swiftness and efficiency that would later characterize pandemics throughout history. In a time before modern medicine, when there was little understanding of bacteria and viruses, the speed with which the plague spread was terrifying. Imagine living through this crisis. First, you have the environmental upheaval. The sun is obscured, crops fail, and food becomes scarce. But then, just when you think things couldn't get worse, you begin to hear whispers of a sickness spreading through your town. It's just a cough. At first, perhaps a few people become ill, and then the death toll begins to rise. The plague isn't just a single illness. It manifests in various forms, each more horrifying than the last. Some victims develop buboes, swollen and painful lymph nodes that become a visible sign of infection. Others suffer from fever chills and delirium. The smell of death hangs heavy in the air as bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. Historians still debate the exact nature of the disease that struck in 536, but it's widely believed that the bubonic plague was the primary culprit. While modern medicine has given us the tools to understand and treat the disease in the 6th century, people could only react with fear and confusion. What was once a bustling marketplace or a busy street now seemed like a scene from a nightmare, with people falling ill left and right, their bodies succumbing to the mysterious affliction. Many died within a matter of days, their lives snuffed out in the blink of an eye. The social and political consequences of the plague were far-reaching. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian, who was already struggling to hold his empire together in the face of the environmental disaster, now had to contend with the plague. His empire was already stretched thin, and the disease drained its resources. Cities became ghost towns as the population was decimated, and the very infrastructure of the empire began to deteriorate. The disease not only claimed lives, but also sowed fear and confusion in the ranks of the military. Soldiers, who had once been ready to defend the empire against its enemies, were now fighting a different kind of battle. One against a silent, unseen force that could not be reasoned with, and whose effects were even more deadly than the sword. This plague, which would later return to haunt the empire throughout the 6th and 7th centuries, was not the only disease of the time. The weakening of the population, coupled with a lack of medical knowledge, allowed other diseases to spread. Malaria, typhus, and other infections would continue to plague the people throughout the century, exacerbating the difficulties of survival. With the weather growing colder, people crowded into spaces together, hoping to find warmth and shelter from the ongoing crisis. But this only facilitated the spread of disease. The plague was not confined to the Byzantine Empire. It spread throughout the Mediterranean, hitting Italy, North Africa, and even parts of Spain. The effects were felt even as far as the Persian Empire, where it claimed thousands of lives. The massive migration of people seeking safety or better conditions contributed to the rapid spread of the disease. In many ways, the plague was an unspoken force that was just as destructive as the famine and the climate crisis itself. It compounded the suffering of the people who were already struggling to survive in an uncertain world. People in the face of such overwhelming hardship often turned to religion for comfort. The Church, which was already an integral part of Byzantine society, was seen as a refuge for the souls of the suffering. Prayers, penance, and pilgrimages became common as the people tried to appease the divine and seek protection from the unseen forces that had thrown their world into chaos. The idea that the plague was a punishment from God was a powerful motivator for the masses, and it added to the religious fervor of the time. The Church became a source of solace for those who were desperate, but it also contributed to the atmosphere of fear. If the plague was a divine punishment, how could anyone hope to survive it? While the people struggled with both the environmental changes and the plague, the rest of the world wasn't immune to the same challenges. Other parts of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East were affected by the same global climate patterns that led to crop failures and famine. But it was the Byzantine Empire, already beset by political and military challenges, that seemed to bear the heaviest burden. It wasn't just the physical destruction that was so devastating. It was the emotional and psychological toll of living in such uncertain times. The sense of helplessness that gripped the people of 536 was compounded by the terror of a disease they didn't understand. A disease that could strike anyone, regardless of status, wealth, or power. As we look back on this time, it's difficult not to feel a sense of awe at how humanity responded to such overwhelming adversity. The people of 536 were caught in the grip of multiple crises, environmental, political, and health-related, but they survived. They adapted, struggled, and fought through it all. And though it seemed like the world was falling apart, life continued. In some ways, the events of 536 marked the beginning of the end for some civilizations, but they also highlighted the resilience of others. The human spirit, it seems, is capable of surviving even the darkest times. By the time the plague was ravaging the Byzantine Empire and other parts of the world, the effects of the volcanic eruption and the resultant climate shifts were becoming more apparent. It wasn't just the cooling temperatures and the absence of sunlight that was causing widespread suffering. Society itself was changing. The environmental disruptions weren't just about crops failing or people falling ill. They were reshaping entire civilizations, disrupting trade routes and shifting power dynamics in ways that would have lasting effects for centuries to come. As empires collapsed or were weakened by the dual forces of environmental disaster and disease, new power structures began to emerge. If you were to look at the world of 536 and think about what came next, it would be clear that nothing was ever quite the same after the Year of Darkness. The disintegration of the Byzantine Empire's stability, for instance, did not just mark a political collapse. It was a turning point in the history of global power. It was the moment when the old world built on Roman foundations began to crumble, and new forces were allowed to rise. The Byzantine Empire, under Emperor Justinian, had been experiencing a golden age, at least in the eyes of those who still believed in the Roman dream. His efforts to reconquer the West, to bring the former territories of the Roman Empire back under Byzantine control, were grand and ambitious. But this vision was soon marred by both internal strife and the challenges brought on by the eruption. The harsh winters and crop failures stretched the empire's resources to their breaking point. The fragile state of the economy worsened as trade routes were disrupted, and the flow of goods essential for survival slowed to a crawl. In the midst of this struggle, the plague continued to decimate the population, weakening the empire's ability to respond effectively to both internal revolts and external threats. The military, already stretched thin by wars with Persia, and other groups now had to contend with the ravaging effects of disease. The empire's once formidable strength began to wane as cities emptied and regions were abandoned. And as the Byzantine Empire fought for its survival, something new began to emerge. The darkening skies and the collapse of centralized power created the conditions for new kingdoms to rise from the ashes. Though it might seem like the crisis of 536 was all-encompassing, the world outside of the Byzantine Empire was not standing still. In fact, the fall of one empire often paved the way for the rise of another. The power vacuum left by the weakening of the Byzantine Empire created an opportunity for the expanding Arab caliphates. Islam, which would come to dominate much of the Middle East and beyond, was in its early stages during the 6th century. The spread of the Arab caliphates beginning in the 7th century took advantage of the weakened state of the surrounding empires. As Byzantium crumbled, Persia weakened, and trade routes were destabilized. The Arab world found itself in a position to expand rapidly, using the turmoil to solidify their new emerging power. In Europe, the collapse of Roman institutions and the subsequent rise of barbarian kingdoms also shifted the course of history. The Germanic tribes that had been slowly integrating into the Roman world now took control over former Roman territories. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks took advantage of the power vacuum left by the fall of Rome and Byzantine instability. This created a patchwork of smaller kingdoms across the continent, some vying for dominance, others focused on rebuilding after the global disaster. Take the Franks, for example. As the Western Roman Empire fell apart, the Franks began to consolidate their power under leaders like Clovis I. Clovis, who would go on to unite much of modern-day France, played a pivotal role in reshaping Europe's future. The Frankish kingdom would later be a key player in the shaping of medieval Europe, ultimately leading to the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. But what is particularly interesting is how the Franks navigated the changing world during the environmental disaster of 536. They were not immune to the cold, the famine, or the disease that ravaged Europe, but they adapted by finding ways to survive amidst the chaos. They understood that survival was not just about holding power. It was about staying flexible, adjusting to the changing landscape of their world. As we look back at the collapse of empires and the rise of new powers in the wake of 536, it's clear that the volcanic eruption, the cooling temperatures, and the global famine didn't just reshape the lives of individuals, they reshaped the course of history. The old order was gone, and a new world was emerging, one that would be defined by smaller, more localized kingdoms, shifting alliances, and the constant struggle for survival. For all the hardship, it's interesting to note how people adapted to this new world. They didn't sit idly by and wait for things to return to the way they were. Instead, they evolved, fought, and found new ways to thrive in an environment that seemed beyond their control. But the emergence of new power structures was not without its challenges. The shifting political landscape created a complex and often volatile situation. Kingdoms rose and fell, not just because of the usual military campaigns, but because of the deeper, more destabilizing effects of the climate crisis and the diseases that spread in its wake. Entire populations were displaced, and the world's great cities became quieter, emptier, and more fragile. In many ways, this was the world's first true glimpse of the medieval era, a time when the old structures of power collapsed and new forms of governance and society had to emerge from the wreckage. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Amidst the darkness, there was always a flicker of light. People kept fighting, building, and adapting. And while some kingdoms collapsed, others learned from their predecessors and found ways to navigate the storm. The world might have been unrecognizable in 536, but humanity's capacity for adaptation and resilience remained a constant propelling them into a new, unknown world. What's fascinating about the aftermath of 536 is that while it may seem like a moment of pure devastation, it was also a turning point in history. The events of that year set the stage for the changes that would shape the medieval world, bringing both challenges and opportunities. The collapse of the old powers and the rise of new ones marked the beginning of a long and complex journey that would lead humanity into a completely different era. As the volcanic winter continued to grip the earth in 536, the world's societies were not just suffering from famine, disease, and political turmoil. They were also experiencing a cultural shift. These climate shifts, the changes to the environment, the devastating crop failures, the loss of livestock didn't just affect physical survival. They altered the very way that people thought about the world, their place in it, and how they understood the forces that governed their lives. These shifts created a fertile ground for religious, cultural, and intellectual change. At the heart of this cultural shift was the way people viewed the divine and their relationship with the natural world. For many, the darkness that had descended upon the earth was more than just a weather phenomenon. It was a sign, an omen, a message from the heavens. As the ancient Greeks and Romans had done before, people began to look for signs in the natural world to explain the inexplicable. When the sun failed to shine, when the crops withered, and when disease struck with no apparent cause, the people of 536 began to see the hand of the gods in every aspect of their lives. In the Byzantine Empire, the religious response was particularly pronounced. Emperor Justinian, a devout Christian, saw the strange weather and the spread of plague as signs of divine punishment. The empire had been experiencing significant political strife with internal revolts, military struggles, and economic issues. These misfortunes were seen by many as God's judgment for the sins of the empire. For those living through the crisis, this idea provided a semblance of order in an otherwise chaotic world. It gave them a way to make sense of the suffering around them. In times of uncertainty, religious faith often became a way to cope, even if it meant accepting that divine punishment was at hand. But it wasn't just in the Byzantine Empire, where religion shaped the response to the climate crisis. Across Europe and Asia, various religious practices became intertwined with survival. In many parts of the world, people turned to their gods asking for mercy and relief from the suffering that had befallen them. Some communities held large religious ceremonies to seek divine favor. Others adopted new forms of religious expression influenced by the uncertainty and fear that dominated the period. The belief in divine retribution or favor became a defining feature of the cultural landscape during this time. At the same time, religious leaders took advantage of the widespread fear and uncertainty to solidify their influence over the people. In the Byzantine Empire, the church became an essential source of both comfort and power. Priests and bishops armed with their divine knowledge and the authority of the church were seen as the mediators between the suffering populace and the higher powers. Religious rituals, such as prayers for protection from the plague, became commonplace as people sought to appease the divine and hope for a better future. But religion was not the only factor shaping people's responses to the crisis. As the year 536 stretched into 537 and beyond, there were also more practical responses to the environmental and social upheaval. People began to rethink their agricultural practices, searching for new ways to survive in the face of failing crops. With the weather growing colder and the growing season shrinking, ancient farming techniques that had once been reliable were no longer viable. People began to rely more heavily on stored grains hunting and fishing, seeking out new methods to supplement their diet. This search for survival strategies led to a period of innovation, albeit born out of necessity. People became more inventive in how they sourced food and materials. Ancient communities, particularly in the Byzantine Empire, were forced to rely on trade for goods and resources they could no longer produce locally. While trade routes had been disrupted by the environmental crisis, Some regions adapted by increasing their efforts to maintain these trade links, however frail they might have been. The exchange of goods, particularly food and medicinal herbs, became vital for survival. Cities, once centers of bustling commerce and exchange, began to see more localized economies, where barter and personal networks played an increasingly important role. At the same time, the pressure on the environment led to the reimagining of human settlement patterns. Some regions, particularly those most affected by crop failures and famine, saw the rise of fortified cities and more defensive structures. People sought refuge in towns and cities where they could better protect themselves from the chaos that had unfolded in the countryside. As the weather grew colder, the need for warmth became paramount. In cities across the empire, the need for building materials and supplies increased, and the demand for food reached new heights. In some cases, urban centers became overcrowded, leading to further strain on the already limited resources available. But despite these challenges, cities also became hubs of resilience. They were the places where new solutions to the crisis were tried and tested. Perhaps, most notably, the period following 536 marked a time when intellectual thought, particularly around survival and the environment, began to be viewed differently. Scholars and thinkers of the time, many of whom were aligned with the Church, began to theorize about the natural world and its effects on humanity in ways that had not been fully explored before. The disaster of 536 and its aftermath sparked new debates on theology, science, and philosophy. While it would be centuries before modern scientific approaches to environmental change would emerge, the intellectual curiosity and drive to understand the events unfolding around them became a precursor to future intellectual movements. The long-term cultural impact of the year 536 is difficult to quantify. The experience of living through a year of darkness and widespread disaster left deep scars in the collective memory of humanity. The survivors of this era would pass down their experiences to future generations, shaping the stories and myths that would eventually become part of the cultural fabric of the Middle Ages. In many ways, the trauma of 536 and the years that followed set the stage for the development of medieval religious thought, agricultural practices, and even early scientific exploration. But the most striking feature of this period was the resilience of the people. Despite the famine, despite the disease, despite the uncertainty, they kept going. They adapted, survived, and rebuilt. And over time, the world began to warm again. The crops returned, and the darkness lifted. But the memory of that year, the year when the world seemed to tilt on its axis, remained etched in the minds of those who lived through it. The legacy of 536 is one of resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity has the capacity to survive, adapt, and rebuild. Though the world would never be the same, the experience of that year helped to shape the civilizations that would rise from its ashes. And in many ways, it's a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the world began to slowly recover from the devastating effects of the volcanic winter and the plague, there was a palpable shift in the very fabric of human civilization. The year 536 and its aftermath had done more than just disrupt the natural world and society. It had altered the course of history in ways that were not immediately apparent, but would eventually shape the future of the Western world. The early 6th century had marked a profound rupture in the continuity of empires, politics, economies, and cultures. However, despite the unimaginable hardships, people kept pushing forward, and in the centuries that followed they would rebuild, reimagine, and even thrive in a new world that emerged from the ashes. One of the most remarkable aspects of the years following 536 was the survival of knowledge. Despite the massive setbacks in agriculture, military struggles, and public health crises, the ancient world's intellectual and artistic traditions did not vanish. While many scholars may not have survived the ravages of disease, some knowledge was preserved in texts, religious teachings, and oral traditions. The darkened skies, the cold temperatures, and the famine caused by the volcanic eruption were temporary, but the stories of survival of faith, of adaptation, and resilience became part of the cultural DNA for future generations. In the Byzantine Empire, though the loss of life was staggering and the economy faltered, intellectual and religious traditions remained strong. The Church, which played a significant role in guiding the spiritual and daily lives of people, also helped preserve the knowledge of the past. Christian scholars, many of them working under the patronage of Emperor Justinian, were able to preserve, copy, and disseminate classical texts. These scholars, working in a society deeply shaped by religious thought, would later serve as the conduits for the intellectual revival that would occur in the medieval period. While the immediate effects of the crisis left the empire in turmoil, in the long term, it was these very intellectual traditions that would help guide the rebirth of learning, known as the Carolingian Renaissance, several centuries later. Even in the far reaches of Western Europe, where the fall of Rome had created political fragmentation and chaos, there was a spark of intellectual continuity. The monastic communities that would become so vital to the preservation of knowledge in the Middle Ages began to form during this period. Monasteries became the places where the few surviving scholars, often monks, dedicated themselves to copying ancient manuscripts and religious texts. These monasteries, nestled in isolated areas, far from the urban centers of the crumbling Roman world, helped keep the ancient flame of learning alive. Though they were often isolated from the greater world, these monks were among the few who had the tools, the literacy, and the knowledge to preserve what had been passed down from the classical world. And yet, as the intellectual world fought to keep hold of the past, the actual landscape of the world was changing. As the environmental disaster unfolded in 536, it forced societies to rethink their place within nature and how they interacted with the world around them. Agriculture, which had once been taken for granted as a stable foundation for civilization, now became an unpredictable and dangerous endeavor. Farmers, forced to deal with failing crops, harsh winters, and the uncertainty of the seasons, developed new strategies and techniques to cope with the changing environment. Crop rotation, new methods of irrigation, and changes in agricultural practice were some of the responses to the crisis, and although many of these solutions were rudimentary, by modern standards they laid the groundwork for the later development of more sophisticated agricultural systems. In the aftermath of this environmental disaster, societies also began to place a greater emphasis on community survival. The larger centralized empires that had once dominated the landscape were weakening, and the smaller, more localized kingdoms and cities were adapting by strengthening their social bonds. Local leaders, whether they were kings, nobles, or religious figures, became central to helping their communities survive the harsh conditions. Trade between regions became more localized, with communities relying on one another for resources. This shift in focus from large imperial networks to more localized economies and societies had a profound impact on the way that medieval Europe would develop in the centuries to come. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the year 536 was the slow emergence of new power structures. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the weakening of the Byzantine Empire, new kingdoms and entities began to take form. The rise of the early medieval kingdoms, like the Frankish kingdom under Clovis and the Saxon territories of the British Isles, signaled the transition from the ancient to the medieval world. These early kingdoms, shaped by both the social upheaval and the environmental disaster of the 6th century, began to lay the groundwork for the future political landscape of Europe. They were marked by a greater emphasis on local control, smaller but more resilient communities, and an increasing reliance on the power of religious and royal leaders to guide their people. As these kingdoms slowly took shape, they also began to develop their own systems of law and governance. For example, the Franks under Clovis and his successors worked to consolidate their power by adopting Christianity as a unifying force. This religious shift, which aligned the Franks with the Catholic Church, had long-term ramifications. The influence of the Church in political matters would play a major role in the shaping of Europe's political systems for centuries to come. The Frankish kingdom, which was initially built through conquest and strategic alliances, would later become the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, ushering in a new era of European history. The impact of the climate changes of 536, though profoundly negative at the time, was thus a catalyst for the long-term transformation of the medieval world. The volcanic eruption, the subsequent cooling of the earth in the years of famine and plague, helped to reshape not only the physical environment, but the very structures of power and society. In this context, it is possible to view the hardships of the 6th century as a crucible in which the medieval world was forged. While we may think of these events as a distant and isolated catastrophe, they were in fact an essential part of the journey that led to the rise of medieval Europe. And while the survivors of the year 536 might not have known it at the time, they were laying the foundation for a new world that would eventually give rise to the great institutions, philosophies, and kingdoms that would define the medieval era. The resilience of those who lived through the darkest years of the 6th century is a testament to the strength of human spirit. They may not have understood the full impact of the volcanic eruption, the climatic shifts, or the diseases that swept through the land, but they endured, adapted, and survived. And in doing so, they ensured that the world would eventually recover, and that the lessons learned from this catastrophe would echo through history. The eventual recovery from the environmental catastrophe of 536 did not happen overnight. In fact, the damage done by the volcanic eruption, the resulting climatic shifts, the famine, and the devastating plague took decades to undo. The immediate aftermath of this period was marked by a long struggle for survival, both for individuals and societies. But what is fascinating about this period is the way in which humanity slowly and inexorably began to rebuild, adapt, and emerge stronger from the ashes of disaster. The story of the years following 536 is not simply one of collapse and ruin. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and the eventual triumph of human ingenuity and spirit. After the disastrous effects of the volcanic eruption and the subsequent climate changes, the global population was severely diminished. The plague alone is believed to have wiped out between a third and a half of the Byzantine Empire's population, and it spread through Europe. Asia and the Middle East wreaked havoc on societies already struggling with food shortages. The most severe consequences of these years were felt in the cities where crowded living conditions and limited medical knowledge led to the swift and lethal spread of disease. It wasn't just the rich or the poor who were affected. No one was immune from the grasp of this silent killer. As cities became ghost towns, the old political and economic systems started to break down. Once powerful empires, like the Byzantine Empire, the Western Roman Empire's successor states, and other centralized governments, found themselves unable to cope with the enormity of the disaster. Resources were exhausted, and trust in the institutions that had once guided these societies was eroded. Political stability crumbled as famine and disease tore through cities and towns, leaving once thriving communities in ruin. But the end of an empire doesn't always mean the end of civilization. As the old power structures began to crumble, the survivors found ways to reconfigure their societies. In the absence of central authority, local leadership took on new importance. Small kingdoms and local lords took charge of the communities that remained, and the concept of local control began to gain prominence. This shift from centralized to decentralized governance would become one of the defining features of medieval Europe. Where once there were large, sprawling empires, now there were smaller, more localized units that could more effectively respond to the needs of their people. These new forms of governance would eventually form the foundation of the medieval feudal system, which would dominate Europe for centuries to come. The shift toward local governance was not just a political necessity, it was also a cultural transformation. People began to focus on their local communities rather than distant rulers or emperors. The importance of the church grew even more during this time, as it was often one of the few stable institutions that could provide a sense of unity and purpose. The church became not only a religious center, but also an administrative one, often stepping into the gaps left by the collapse of the state. In many ways, the church was the glue that held society together during the turbulent years following 536. Even as the political landscape shifted, so, too, did the way people viewed their relationship with nature. The environmental disruptions of 536 forced communities to rethink their agricultural practices and methods of food production. The years of crop failures and food shortages were not just a momentary crisis. They had a lasting impact on how people would farm in the future. New methods of agriculture emerged, and the knowledge that people had acquired over centuries of farming began to be adapted to the changing climate. Irrigation systems were improved. Crop rotations were implemented more widely, and new techniques for storing food were developed. These innovations helped to ensure that future generations would be better prepared for the next environmental challenge. As the world began to warm again, and the sun slowly returned to its rightful place in the sky, life gradually returned to some semblance of normalcy. But this recovery was not linear, and it did not happen in a vacuum. The world that emerged from the chaos of 536 was one that had been permanently altered. The social, political, and cultural landscape had changed, and so too had the relationship between humanity and the environment. The world was no longer the same place it had been before the volcanic winter, but in many ways it had been reshaped by the adversity it had faced. One of the most striking features of the recovery period was the way that the survivors, both individuals and societies, found new ways to thrive. The resilience of these people who had endured the cold, the famine, the disease, and the uncertainty of the times is truly remarkable. Despite the loss of life, despite the trauma, despite the profound upheaval, these communities did not give up. They adapted, they rebuilt, they survived. This ability to recover from even the darkest moments is what allowed humanity to eventually emerge from the crisis stronger and more capable than before. The recovery also sparked a renewed focus on the future. As people began to rebuild their cities and kingdoms, they also began to look to new ways of thinking, new technologies, and new forms of social organization. The intellectual and philosophical movements of the future would owe much to the trauma and disruption caused by the volcanic winter. It was during this time that the foundations of the medieval world were laid, and much of the knowledge and cultural legacy of the ancient world was preserved and passed down to future generations. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this recovery was the way in which people came together. In times of crisis, communities often pull together in ways that are unimaginable during more stable times. The bonds that were forged in the fire of the crisis became the foundation for future social cohesion. Even as kingdoms and empires rose and fell, the enduring strength of community remained. The importance of working together, of supporting one another through hardship, became a central tenet of life in the medieval world. Looking back at the aftermath of the year 536, it is easy to see how far humanity has come. The people of that time could not have imagined the world that would emerge from the wreckage, but in many ways their resilience and ingenuity laid the groundwork for the world we live in today. The legacy of their survival, their ability to adapt to a rapidly changing world, and their determination to rebuild continues to inspire us. The year 536 was the beginning of a new chapter in human history. It was a time of unimaginable hardship, but it was also a time of immense transformation. It was a pivotal moment in the development of human societies, and its impact reverberated for centuries to come. The story of survival and recovery in the wake of the global disaster of 536 is not just a tale of loss. It is a story of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable will of the human spirit. As the world struggled to recover from the catastrophic events of 536, new social, cultural, and economic realities began to take shape. The effects of the volcanic eruption, the long winters, and the subsequent plague reverberated far beyond the immediate crises, influencing the trajectory of human history for centuries to come. While the year 536 is often remembered as a time of darkness and despair, it also marked a moment when the foundations for the medieval world were being quietly laid. The recovery from such devastation required not just survival, but reinvention of agriculture, governance, and social structures. The challenge was immense, but so was the human capacity for adaptation. One of the most immediate effects of the crisis was the dramatic shift in agriculture. Before the eruption, many civilizations were used to relatively stable cycles of planting and harvesting. Farmers had long relied on the changing seasons to predict when to plant and when to harvest. The unpredictable weather patterns that followed the eruption, however, threw these cycles into chaos. The cold temperatures, the cloudy skies, and the shorter growing seasons made it nearly impossible for crops to flourish as they had in previous years. The result was widespread famine, the likes of which had not been seen before. Yet, in the face of this devastating shortage of food, agricultural practices began to change. New techniques were adopted out of necessity, some of which would shape the future of farming for centuries to come. People began to experiment with different types of crops that were better suited to colder temperatures or shorter growing seasons. More importantly, the crisis forced agricultural communities to think creatively and resourcefully. Crop rotation, for example, became a more widely practiced technique, helping to preserve soil quality and maintain some degree of food production despite the harsh climate. This was an early sign of how humans were beginning to adapt to their environment in ways that would sustain them long after the immediate crisis had passed. Alongside agricultural adaptation, there was a marked shift in how communities viewed trade and resource distribution. The collapse of centralized empires and political structures meant that traditional trade routes were no longer as reliable. Cities, once hubs of commerce and culture, became isolated. With the breakdown of these vast trade networks, the focus shifted to more localized systems of exchange. Barter became more common as people turned to their neighbors for the goods they could no longer access through traditional channels. It was a return to a more localized economy, one that was more focused on survival than on luxury. People grew more self-sufficient, relying on their immediate communities to meet their needs. This decentralized economy also meant that power became more localized and the traditional reliance on kings and emperors diminished. Small local rulers and leaders, often from the surviving communities, began to take on more influence. This shift in power dynamics was also reflected in the changing role of religion during this period. While the collapse of empires meant that traditional political institutions were struggling, religion remained a steady and influential force. The Church, in particular, became central to the lives of many people, providing both spiritual and material support during the darkest years. The Church's involvement in social and economic matters increased significantly, as it became one of the few institutions capable of maintaining some degree of order in the midst of such widespread chaos. But the role of religion was not just confined to providing comfort. In many ways, it also helped shape the future of society by offering a moral framework for rebuilding. The idea of divine punishment, which had been a prominent feature of people's understanding of the crisis, was gradually replaced by the belief that the trials of the period were a test of faith. This shift helped to solidify the Church's role as not just a religious institution, but also a center of moral and ethical authority. In this way, the Church became a stabilizing force, during a time when many people might have otherwise lost faith in the social and political systems that had once governed them. In terms of intellectual and cultural development, the years following 536 marked a profound change in how people viewed the world. The intellectual traditions of the ancient world, especially those of Greece and Rome, were not lost during the crises of the 6th century, but they were reshaped. Scholars, particularly Christian monks, became the custodians of ancient knowledge. The surviving manuscripts and texts from the classical world were copied and preserved in monastic libraries, ensuring that the intellectual traditions of antiquity would survive the collapse of the Roman Empire. These monks, often living in isolated communities, were not only responsible for preserving ancient works, but also for innovating new ways of thinking. This preservation of knowledge would lay the foundation for the intellectual revival that would come centuries later, during the Carolingian Renaissance. It was in the monasteries that the seeds of medieval scholarship and learning were planted. The monks who devoted themselves to copying texts, studying theology, and preserving the knowledge of the past were in a very real sense the architects of the future. They played a critical role in the survival of the ancient intellectual heritage, ensuring that the knowledge of the past would not be forgotten as the world continued to evolve. Despite all the suffering and hardship, this period also saw the beginnings of a cultural renaissance. The chaos of the 6th century, while devastating, created a space for new ideas, new cultural expressions, and new forms of governance. While the effects of the volcanic winter and the subsequent plague were deeply traumatic, they also acted as a catalyst for change. The people who survived the immediate crises were forced to rethink the way they lived and the way their societies were structured. They began to question old assumptions about power, religion, and survival. One of the most important aspects of this transformation was the emergence of a more localized, decentralized world. As the centralized empires collapsed, new forms of governance emerged that were better suited to the realities of the post-crisis world. Kingdoms and regions that had once been part of larger empires now became more independent, often with their own local leaders and systems of rule. This shift to more localized control was a precursor to the feudal system that would later dominate medieval Europe. Feudalism, with its reliance on local lords and vassals, would emerge as a direct response to the challenges of living in a world that was no longer stable or predictable. The story of the recovery from the year 536 is in many ways a story of rebirth. While it may have taken generations for the full effects of the crisis to dissipate, the people who lived through those dark years found ways to rebuild and reinvent their world. The crises of the 6th century did not mark the end of civilization. On the contrary, they acted as a catalyst for the development of new systems of governance, new economic practices, and a renewed focus on community survival. These changes, born out of necessity, would eventually give rise to the medieval world, which would be defined by its feudal systems, its deep religious devotion, and its emphasis on localized control. As we look back on the events of 536, it is easy to see them as a moment of tragedy and destruction. But in reality, this period also marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The resilience of those who lived through the dark days of the 6th century ensured that civilization would not be lost. Instead, it adapted, evolved, and eventually emerged stronger than ever. The legacy of 536 is not just one of suffering, but also of resilience, transformation, and hope for the future. As the world began to recover from the cataclysmic events of 536, the human experience during this period was transformed in many profound ways. The years following 536 marked the transition from a fragmented, decaying world to a restructured medieval society characterized by new forms of political, social, and economic organization. The effects of the volcanic eruption, the cooling temperatures, and the widespread plague were undeniably catastrophic, but they also set in motion a complex process of recovery that would shape the future of civilization for centuries to come. When you consider the aftermath of such a global disaster, it's easy to focus on the immediate suffering, the deaths, the famine, and the collapse of governments. However, what is often overlooked is the long-term resilience of human societies in the face of adversity. While many of the great empires of the ancient world crumbled under the weight of this crisis, new social structures began to take shape. And while these changes may not have been immediately apparent, the seeds of the medieval world were sown during this tumultuous period. As the population declined due to the combined effects of famine, disease, and environmental collapse, the survivors had to navigate a world that had become much less predictable. For much of the ancient world, the relationship between nature and human activity had been taken for granted. But now, with entire civilizations teetering on the brink of collapse, people were forced to confront the fragility of their existence. The trauma of these years altered the way people viewed the world, their place in it, and their relationships with the forces of nature. This shift in perspective had a profound impact on the way societies were structured. The centralization of power that had characterized the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire began to dissolve as communities became more self-reliant. Local leaders and landowners took on greater importance, as they were the ones who could ensure the survival of their people. The rise of localized power, which would later become a defining feature of feudalism, can be traced back to this period of recovery. The fall of centralized authority also coincided with a shift in how people viewed social and political relationships. The vast bureaucracies of the ancient empires, which had once kept society running in a relatively predictable way, were replaced by more localized and personal systems of governance. Leaders were no longer seen as distant emperors or kings, but as figures who directly influenced the lives of their subjects. The sense of community became more important, and the focus shifted from the distant power of the state to the immediate concerns of survival, security, and well-being. As the medieval world began to take shape, religion played a crucial role in maintaining social cohesion. In the absence of strong centralized governments, religious institutions provided not only spiritual guidance, but also social and political stability. The Church, in particular, became a powerful force in both the governance and cultural life of Europe. Its influence reached far beyond the religious sphere, with church leaders often serving as political mediators, legal authorities, and social leaders. The Church's ability to maintain order during a time of unprecedented crisis was a testament to the deep integration of religion into everyday life during this period. While religious institutions were pivotal in shaping the social and political landscape, they were also responsible for preserving the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. In the wake of the environmental catastrophe, it was the monasteries and religious scholars who took on the responsibility of preserving and transmitting knowledge. Ancient texts, many of which had been written in Greek and Latin, were carefully copied and stored in the libraries of the Church. These monks and scholars, isolated in their monastic communities, became the keepers of knowledge, ensuring that the intellectual traditions of the classical world were not lost to the ravages of time and disaster. The intellectual revival that would later come to fruition during the Carolingian Renaissance was built on the work of these early scholars. The monasteries, which had long been centers of religious worship and learning, became the epicenters of the rebirth of classical knowledge. The study of ancient philosophy, literature, and science was reinvigorated, albeit under the umbrella of Christian theology. This marriage of classical learning and Christian thought would come to define much of the intellectual life of the Middle Ages, and it laid the groundwork for the development of scholasticism and the establishment of universities centuries later. Meanwhile, the crisis of the 6th century had also sparked significant cultural shifts. The trauma of the volcanic eruption and the subsequent plague had forced people to confront the impermanence of life and the vulnerability of human civilization. These existential questions would manifest in the art, literature, and philosophy of the time. As people struggled to survive in the wake of such destruction, They turned to religion and the afterlife as a way to make sense of their suffering. This focus on the divine, on life after death, and on spiritual salvation would become a hallmark of medieval thought and culture. One of the most significant cultural shifts that occurred during this period was the rise of monasticism. The idea of retreating from the world in order to dedicate oneself to prayer and contemplation became more widespread during and after the crisis of 536. Monasticism, which had existed in various forms throughout history, became increasingly popular as people sought solace from the suffering around them. Monks living in isolated communities devoted themselves to spiritual practice and intellectual work, and their influence on medieval society grew as the Church's power increased. While the rise of monasticism was one way that people coped with the trauma of the 6th century, it also played a vital role in preserving the cultural memory of the ancient world. Monasteries became centers of literacy and learning, where ancient texts were preserved, copied, and studied. These monks helped to safeguard the intellectual legacy of the Roman Empire and the classical world, ensuring that future generations would have access to the knowledge that had survived the destruction of the 6th century. In the larger social context, the early Middle Ages saw the rise of new forms of social organization. The collapse of the old Roman Empire and the decentralization of power meant that new political structures had to emerge. The feudal system, which would dominate medieval Europe for centuries, began to take shape during this period. In a world where survival was increasingly dependent on local resources and networks, feudalism provided a way to organize society around the land, with local lords providing protection in exchange for service from their vassals. This system would come to define the political and social structures of Europe, as the focus shifted from large centralized empires to smaller, more localized communities. The development of feudalism was also closely tied to the rise of the knightly class, which emerged as a response to the need for protection and defense in a world that had become much more dangerous. The knights, who would come to symbolize the feudal system, played an essential role in maintaining order and defending their territories. Their role in society would evolve over the centuries, but their origins can be traced back to this period of recovery, when the need for local protection was paramount. As the years passed, the world began to warm again. The sun, which had been obscured by volcanic ash, slowly returned, bringing with it more stable weather patterns. Crops began to grow once again, and the world gradually recovered from the environmental devastation that had seemed so insurmountable. But the recovery was not just physical. It was also cultural and intellectual. The societies that emerged from the ashes of 536 were shaped by the crisis they had endured, and they carried with them the lessons of resilience, adaptation, and survival. The legacy of the year 536 and its aftermath is a reminder of the strength of human spirit. It serves as a testament to the ability of people to rebuild and adapt, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. The recovery from this period of darkness was slow, but it was steady. And in the end, the world that emerged from the disaster of 536 was one that was forever changed, not just in terms of political structures and agricultural practices, but in the way people understood their place in the world. As the world began to recover from the environmental catastrophe of 536 societies across the globe, had to confront the reality that the old ways of doing things simply could not work anymore. The unprecedented events, the volcanic eruption, the plague, the sudden cooling of the planet forced humanity to adapt in ways that were both revolutionary and sometimes desperate. The consequences were far-reaching. Economies were shattered, cities were emptied, and populations were decimated. But what came out of these challenges after the immediate suffering was a new world order, one that would shape the medieval landscape for centuries to come. The collapse of the Roman Empire had already set the stage for a world that was more fragmented, more localized, and more dependent on community cohesion. Yet the disasters of 536 accelerated this shift, forcing societies to make do with what they had. With centralized authorities faltering and the population shrinking, the concept of self-reliance became paramount. In many ways, this laid the groundwork for the medieval feudal system, which became a defining characteristic of the European Middle Ages. Lords, knights, and peasants would become the central figures of a new social structure, one based not on the vast imperial systems of the past, but on localized control and personal relationships. What's truly remarkable, however, is how this system of governance, though born out of necessity, would persist for so long. The recovery from 536 was a slow process, but over the course of several centuries, the systems that had emerged in the wake of the environmental disaster would provide a foundation for the medieval period. As the old centralized systems of governance fell apart, new centers of power emerged in local regions. The traditional political entities, such as the Byzantine and Roman empires, could no longer maintain their authority over vast stretches of land. Instead, power shifted toward local landowners who could ensure their own survival, provide security to their people, and act as mediators in disputes. This was the beginning of feudalism, a system in which land was the most valuable resource, and loyalty was the key currency. At its core, feudalism was a way for people to survive in an environment that was increasingly hostile and unpredictable. The collapse of long-distance trade routes meant that people could no longer rely on the supply of goods and services from distant places. As a result, they turned inward, relying on local resources for sustenance and security. The feudal system worked by creating a reciprocal relationship between the lords and their vassals. The lords would provide land protection and security, and in return their vassals would offer military service and loyalty. This arrangement, although born out of crisis, would become the cornerstone of medieval Europe's political system. As feudalism took root, it had a profound effect on the way people lived. The majority of people who were peasants found themselves tied to the land, working for their lords in exchange for protection. Though life for the peasants was still harsh and full of hardship, they had a measure of security that had not existed in the more volatile years that followed 536. Feudalism helped create a sense of stability in a world that had previously been marked by uncertainty and chaos. While it was hardly an ideal system, it was better than the lawlessness and constant warfare that had characterized the post-Roman world. This period of recovery was also marked by a rise in the influence of the Church. The Church, as both a religious and political institution, was one of the few entities that maintained its authority throughout the crisis. While the Roman Empire fell, the Christian Church endured, providing both spiritual and material support to communities that were struggling to survive. The Church's reach expanded, and its influence in political matters grew as well. Church leaders often mediated disputes, provided aid to the poor, and became key players in the political landscape of the time. Interestingly, the Church also became a major player in the intellectual revival that followed the 6th century crisis. Monasteries and religious institutions became the centers of learning, where ancient texts were preserved, copied, and studied. These texts, many of them written in Greek and Latin, held the knowledge of the ancient world. It was the monks isolated in their monasteries who preserved the intellectual legacy of the Roman Empire and Greece. In a time when the world seemed to be falling apart, the preservation of knowledge became a priority, and it was these monks who ensured that ancient ideas and philosophies would be passed down to future generations. These religious institutions not only preserved knowledge, but also helped to shape the intellectual landscape of the medieval world. The study of ancient texts, coupled with the growing influence of Christian theology, gave rise to the development of scholasticism, a philosophical and theological system that would dominate medieval intellectual life. The scholastics, who sought to reconcile Christian teachings with the philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, would play a critical role in shaping medieval thought and culture. They helped to keep alive the ancient intellectual traditions even as they adapted them to fit the Christian worldview. As the centuries passed, the influence of the Church only grew. The medieval world was deeply religious, and the Church played a central role in the daily lives of its people. From the Pope in Rome to the local parish priest, the Church was an omnipresent force in medieval society. The Church's teachings provided a moral framework for people to live by, and its influence over political matters was undeniable. Even kings and emperors had to answer to the Pope, and the Church's authority extended well beyond religious matters, shaping the political and social landscape of Europe. Along with the rise of the Church and the solidification of feudalism came the emergence of new social structures. The knightly class, which would come to symbolize the ideals of chivalry, began to take shape during this period. Knights, often bound by a code of honor and loyalty, played an essential role in the feudal system. They were the protectors of the land, serving their lords in exchange for land and titles. The code of chivalry, which emphasized bravery, loyalty, and the protection of the weak, would become a central part of medieval culture. The knights were the enforcers of feudal law, and their role in society would evolve over time. In addition to the rise of the knightly class, there was also the growth of towns and trade which, while limited in the immediate aftermath of 536, would become more significant as time passed. The decline of the Roman Empire and the subsequent collapse of long-distance trade had made the economy more localized, but eventually, as the world began to warm again and stability returned, trade routes reopened. The revival of trade would lead to the growth of towns, and with that, the emergence of a new class of merchants and craftsmen. This economic shift would eventually lay the groundwork for the rise of cities and the growth of a more urbanized society. While these changes were slow and often painful, they marked a clear break from the past. The world that emerged from the ashes of 536 was one that had been irrevocably transformed. The environmental disasters, the disease, and the collapse of empires had reshaped society in profound ways. Yet despite the overwhelming challenges, humanity had not only survived, it had adapted. And in doing so, it had laid the foundation for a new era in human history, one that would come to be defined by feudalism, the Church, and a renewed emphasis on local control. The transformation that occurred after 536 is a testament to the resilience of human societies. Though the immediate aftermath was marked by uncertainty and hardship, the long-term effects of these changes would have a profound impact on the future of Europe and beyond. The feudal system, the rise of the Church, the preservation of knowledge, and the emergence of a new social order were all part of the rebuilding process that followed the dark years of the 6th century. And while the world that emerged was far from perfect, it was a world that had been shaped by the lessons of survival and adaptation, ensuring that humanity would continue to thrive in the centuries to come. As the centuries passed, and the effects of the environmental catastrophe of 536 slowly receded, a new world began to take shape, built upon the foundations of resilience, adaptation, and a changing relationship with power, faith, and knowledge. By the late 6th and early 7th centuries, the societies that emerged from the rubble of the Old World were shaped not just by the immediate trauma of volcanic eruptions, disease, and famine, but by the long-term recovery of processes that slowly gave birth to a medieval civilization. One of the most crucial aspects of the recovery was the gradual reestablishment of trade networks. In the aftermath of the disruptions of 536, the global economy had fractured. Long-distance trade routes, which once connected far-flung regions from the Roman Empire to the distant reaches of Asia, had all but collapsed. The stagnation of the economy was one of the most visible effects of the global crisis. Goods were scarce, and societies were forced to rely more heavily on localized resources and trade within their communities. The interconnectedness of the ancient world, once so carefully woven together by Roman roads and Mediterranean shipping lanes, was effectively severed by the catastrophic events of the mid-6th century. However, despite the severe setbacks, a slow and steady process of recovery began, particularly as the climate began to stabilize in the years following 536. The warming of the Earth's temperature gradually allowed agricultural production to rebound. As the food shortages began to ease, the foundations for new trade routes were laid. Towns and cities that had suffered from plagues and famine began to repopulate, and the need for goods that had once been easy to acquire became apparent again. Slowly but surely, merchants began to travel once more, though the scale of trade was far smaller than it had been before. This re-establishment of trade, while initially limited in scope, laid the foundation for the commercial revolution that would emerge centuries later during the High Middle Ages. But the revitalization of trade did not only affect the economy, it also had profound social consequences. As commerce began to thrive again, so too did the emergence of a new middle class. While the feudal system remained the dominant structure of medieval society, the reemergence of trade began to blur the lines between the old social hierarchies. This middle class, which included merchants, artisans, and traders, gradually began to assert its influence on society. It was during this time that the first signs of a more urbanized world began to appear. Cities, once weakened by the plagues and famines, began to grow in importance again. With this growth came new opportunities for social mobility, as wealthy merchants and traders were able to accumulate land and wealth, positioning themselves as power brokers in a world that had once been dominated solely by the nobility. While this new middle class was a force for change, it was the continued dominance of the Church that provided a stabilizing force during this period. The Church, which had survived the collapse of the Roman Empire and weathered the storms of the 6th century, was now more than just a spiritual institution. It had become the central authority in many parts of Europe, overseeing not only the spiritual lives of individuals, but also the political, social, and intellectual life of the time. Its power was vast, and its influence was far-reaching, with church leaders often serving as advisors to kings and rulers, guiding them not only in matters of faith, but also in matters of governance. In this context, the rise of monasticism continued to play a crucial role. While the early Middle Ages had been a period of isolation for the monastic communities, the monasteries were increasingly viewed as centers of learning and culture. Monks who had long been the custodians of ancient texts and knowledge became the intellectual leaders of their communities. The preservation of classical knowledge, as well as the development of new philosophical and theological ideas, was essential for the cultural development of the medieval world. The Church's involvement in education, intellectual exchange, and knowledge preservation made it a central pillar in the recovery process. The Church's role was particularly important in the development of medieval universities, which would later become the breeding grounds for scholarship and learning. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the first universities were established in Europe, many of them with the support and direction of the Church. These institutions, which initially focused on theology and philosophy, would later expand their curriculum to include the natural sciences, law, and medicine. The Church's embrace of education, despite its strict control over intellectual pursuits, helped to ensure that the intellectual revival that began after 536 would continue into the later medieval period. At the same time, the influence of the Church was not without its challenges. As the medieval period unfolded, tensions began to grow between the Church and secular rulers. The rise of powerful monarchs, particularly in France and England, began to challenge the authority of the Church. Kings and emperors sought to consolidate their power, and they increasingly viewed the Church's authority as an obstacle to their own political ambitions. The centuries following 536 saw the rise of conflicts between church and state, culminating in the investiture controversy of the 11th century. and the eventual schisms between Roman Catholicism and various Protestant movements centuries later. Despite these challenges, the Church remained a central force throughout the medieval period, and its influence continued to shape the course of European history. As Europe began to emerge from the crises of the 6th century, the Church stood as a symbol of continuity and stability, guiding the people through turbulent times and helping to establish the framework for future intellectual, political, and social development. The Church's role in preserving knowledge, protecting the vulnerable, and fostering social cohesion was critical to the survival of European civilization in the centuries following 536. But it wasn't just the Church that shaped the new world that emerged from the destruction. The feudal system, which had gradually evolved from the collapse of the old empires, became the bedrock of medieval European society. The hierarchical structure of feudalism created a rigid but stable social order, where the nobility controlled land rights, protected that land, and peasants worked it. This system, while often criticized for its inequities, provided the necessary stability for society to rebuild after the calamities of the 6th century. Feudalism also created the conditions for the rise of chivalric ideals. The knights, who were tasked with protecting their lands and serving their lords, came to embody the values of loyalty, bravery, and honor. The ideals of chivalry, which emphasized the protection of the weak and the defense of the Christian faith, would later become central to medieval culture and would shape the literature, art, and social norms of the time. The knights of the medieval period, though often romanticized, were products of the world that emerged from the recovery of the 6th century, and their role in maintaining order and stability was crucial. In this way, the recovery from the disasters of 536 was not just about rebuilding what had been lost. It was also about reimagining the future. The medieval world that emerged from the ashes was one of complexity and change. It was a world defined by new social structures, new political alliances, and new cultural values. The legacy of 536, though initially catastrophic, ultimately contributed to the development of the world that would come to dominate Europe for the next 1,000 years. The Church, the feudal system, and the rise of new forms of trade and commerce all helped to shape the medieval era, ensuring that the world would not simply recover, but would evolve in ways that no one could have predicted. As the environmental and political chaos of the 6th century began to subside, a fascinating process of cultural, social, and economic transformation occurred. The year 536, marked by its strange weather patterns and a global crisis of unprecedented scale, set the stage for the rise of a new era. Over time, the suffering brought on by volcanic eruptions, the cooling of the climate, and the devastating plague led to the birth of a new world, one that would eventually give rise to the medieval period. While the immediate aftermath of the crisis was bleak, the resilience and adaptability of human societies allowed them to rebuild and in many ways emerge stronger. The challenges of survival during the dark days of the 6th century gave rise to new political systems, intellectual movements, and economic practices that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. Perhaps one of the most important shifts in the aftermath of the 536 catastrophe was the rise of new political and social structures. The once mighty empires of Rome and Byzantium began to falter in the face of the crisis, unable to maintain control over their vast territories. The Roman Empire had already fragmented, but the environmental calamities of the mid-6th century and the plague further weakened it. In the West, the remnants of the empire had already been replaced by a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, but the fall of the Byzantine Empire marked the end of an era. The power vacuum created by the collapse of these great empires led to the rise of new kingdoms, many of which were built on the foundations of feudalism. Feudalism, which emerged in the wake of the crisis, became the dominant social and economic system in Europe for the next 1,000 years. It was a system of local governance in which lords owned land and granted it to vassals in exchange for military service and loyalty. The hierarchical structure of feudalism created a rigid but stable social order that allowed societies to survive and even thrive in an increasingly chaotic world. Under feudalism, power was decentralized, and local lords became the primary sources of authority. They controlled vast estates, managed agricultural production, and provided protection to the people who lived on their land. At the same time, feudalism helped to foster the rise of the knightly class, which became one of the defining features of medieval society. The knights, who were sworn to protect their lords and defend the realm, became the enforcers of feudal law. Their role was not just military. They also embodied the ideals of chivalry, loyalty, honor, and bravery. The knights were the epitome of the feudal system, and their role in medieval society was crucial. They were the ones who maintained order, protected the land, and ensured that the feudal contract was upheld. Their influence on medieval culture would be profound, inspiring the literature, art, and social norms of the time. The knight's code of chivalry, which stressed bravery, loyalty, and respect for women and the weak, was more than just a set of ideals. It became a way of life for those who held power in the medieval world. The chivalric tradition would later be romanticized in the literature and legends of the Middle Ages, where knights like King Arthur and his Round Table were celebrated as paragons of virtue and courage. This idealized vision of the knight would persist throughout the Middle Ages, influencing not only the nobility, but also the broader society. In addition to the rise of feudalism and the knightly class, the Church played an increasingly central role in shaping the course of medieval life. While the Church had always been a powerful institution, its influence grew exponentially after the 6th century crisis. The collapse of centralized political power and the widespread devastation of the plague left many people looking for stability and guidance, which they found in the Church. The Church provided not only spiritual solace, but also a sense of order and continuity in a world that had been thrown into turmoil. Church leaders became influential political figures, and the Pope himself held significant authority, often acting as a mediator between rival kings and emperors. One of the most significant contributions of the Church during this period was its role in preserving knowledge. The Church became the primary institution responsible for the preservation of ancient texts and knowledge, much of which had been lost or forgotten during the chaotic years following the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Monastic communities, which had been established as centers of religious devotion, also became centers of learning. Monks meticulously copied ancient manuscripts, ensuring that the intellectual legacy of the classical world was not lost. This work laid the groundwork for the intellectual revival that would take place during the Carolingian Renaissance, and later during the rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. In addition to preserving ancient knowledge, the Church played a crucial role in shaping the moral and intellectual climate of the Middle Ages. The medieval period was deeply religious, and the Church's teachings were central to the worldview of most Europeans. The Church's influence on education, philosophy, and law shaped the development of medieval thought. It was through the lens of Christianity that much of the intellectual work of the time was interpreted. The Church also helped to define the boundaries of acceptable thought and behavior, ensuring that the medieval worldview remained consistent with Christian doctrine. The role of the Church in the Middle Ages was not without controversy, however. As the centuries passed, tensions began to grow between the Church and secular rulers. The rise of powerful monarchs in France, England, and other parts of Europe led to struggles for control over land wealth and power. Kings and emperors sought to assert their authority over the Church, often leading to conflicts over issues such as the right to appoint bishops and control church lands. These conflicts culminated in events like the investiture controversy and the later schisms that would divide Christianity into Catholic and Protestant branches. However, even as these tensions grew, the Church remained a central force in medieval Europe, shaping the culture, politics, and social structures of the time. The recovery from the devastation of 536 also had profound effects on the economy. The collapse of trade routes and the decline of the agricultural system during the early years of the 6th century left many people struggling to survive. But over time, as the climate began to stabilize and agricultural practices improved, production levels increased. Towns and cities once decimated by plague and famine began to repopulate, and commerce slowly resumed. While it took centuries for trade to return to the scale it had been before the crisis, the revival of commerce eventually led to the growth of markets, guilds, and urban centers. The medieval period would eventually see the rise of a new economic system, the manorial system, where peasants worked the land in exchange for protection and the right to live on the lord's estate. This system, which was a natural outgrowth of feudalism, allowed for a more organized approach to agricultural production. Lords, who controlled the land, relied on the labor of peasants to grow crops, raise animals, and produce goods. In return, peasants received protection from bandits and other threats. This system, though exploitative, provided a measure of stability during the uncertain times of the early Middle Ages. The rise of trade and the growing economic importance of towns and cities would eventually give rise to the merchant class, which would play an increasingly important role in European society. Merchants, who were once limited to small localized markets, began to expand their reach as trade routes reopened and new markets emerged. The growing merchant class would become a powerful force in the development of European economies, eventually contributing to the rise of capitalism and the development of a more market-driven economy in later centuries. The recovery from the devastation of 536 was a slow and often painful process. But the world that emerged from the ashes was one that was deeply changed. New political structures, new economic systems, and new intellectual traditions began to take shape during this period. The challenges of the 6th century had forced humanity to rethink its relationship with power, religion, and knowledge. And while the world of the Middle Ages was far from perfect, it was a world that had been shaped by the resilience and adaptability of its people. Looking back at the long shadow cast by the year 536, it's clear that the effects of the volcanic eruption, the plague, and the climate changes were far-reaching and transformative. What began as a devastating crisis eventually gave rise to a new era in human history, one marked by the rise of feudalism, the growth of the Church's power, and the gradual re-emergence of trade and commerce. The recovery from 536 was not immediate, nor was it without its challenges. But it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of human civilization, a chapter that would continue to unfold for centuries to come. As we reach the end of this journey, let's take a moment to pause and reflect on what we've learned together. The year 536 was a time of darkness and uncertainty, a time when the world seemed to shift on its axis, leaving civilizations struggling to survive. Yet even in the face of catastrophe, humanity found a way to rebuild, adapt, and create something new. The seeds of the medieval world, with its feudal systems, powerful church, and intellectual revival, were sown during this time of crisis. What began as unimaginable hardship became the foundation for the world we recognize today. As you let this story settle into your mind, allow yourself to relax, feeling the calm weight of history's lessons gently guide you. Think about how resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges has been a defining trait of human nature throughout the ages. There is something comforting in knowing that no matter the darkness, people have always found a way forward, even when the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. And now, as the darkness of the past slowly fades into the quiet of the night, it's time for you to rest. Close your eyes, feel the soft embrace of the world around you, and let the soothing rhythm of time's endless march carry you into peaceful sleep. Tomorrow is a new day, and just as history has taught us, it brings with it new opportunities to adapt and grow. Good night, sweet dreams, and may you wake with a sense of calm, knowing that, like those who lived through the trials of the 6th century, you, too, have the strength to face whatever the world brings.